Hey, I'm Liz. I'll be giving you 3 top secret pro tips I've never heard anyone else talk about, and also showing you exactly how I rated and tested these 7 cabin tents here so that you can pick the perfect cabin tent for yourself by the end of this video. For number 7, the best budget cabin tent, I'm gonna compare Coleman, Ozark Trail, and also Core Equipment cabin tents. Which of these 3 will be the best? This is pro tip number 1, how to pick the best budget cabin tent. Here are some test results from one of Coleman's most popular cabin tent, their 10-person instant tent. And here's Core's 9-person instant tent. Which is better? The higher the better, or the lower the better? Let me explain these test results to you. For the first test, even though the Core has a slightly smaller max capacity of 9 people, it has 2 inches more peak height than the Coleman. For the second test, I noticed that the walls of the Coleman were so dang slanted, so I decided to measure the angle of the slant, and that came in at a whopping 35 degrees. On the other hand, the Core walls slanted at just a 15-degree angle, which is much better. The less slanted the walls are, the more livable space you would have inside the tent. And for the third test, the Core has a whopping 3 hubs at the top of the tent, while the Coleman has just a measly 1 hub. So the Coleman felt really droopy, especially on this side of the tent. Notice how the tent kinda caves inwards? Now, on the inside of the tent, the walls were so droopy that I could practically push them outwards myself, and this really ate a lot into my livable space. So, as much as I love Coleman, I have so many of their tents. I think their dome tents are great, but as far as their instant cabin tents go, they're kind of like meh. I don't quite like them. Now, what about Ozark Trail? I tried Ozark's 6-person instant tent. It has the same super slanted walls problem as the Coleman, sloping at a whopping 30-degree angle. And on top of that, it has the lowest peak height that I've ever seen in a 6-person tent, coming in at just 65.5 inches. That's barely even taller than I am. So the moment I take 1 step away from the peak height, my head touches the top of the tent, right here. And here's how much I can walk around the entire tent while still standing upright. On the other hand, with most other cabin tents, I'm usually able to walk around the tent very, very nicely. So if you're looking for a cabin tent, skip this one. What about Ozark's non-instant cabin tents though? Well, I have the 10-person cabin tents from both Core and Ozark. Both are non-instant tents. So you gotta put all the roof poles together, then all the leg poles, and set everything up manually. And this Ozark tent isn't terrible. I mean, it looks very much like the Core. But unfortunately, it's still terrible in rain and lasted just 15 minutes of moderate rain before the seams and fabric both started leaking. The Core, on the other hand, got through 55 minutes of super heavy rain. Also, my Ozark steel poles started rusting a little after just 1 use, and I didn't have the same issue with the Core. Basically, the bottom line is this. When it comes to cabin tents specifically, Core beats Coleman and Ozark Trail. Next up, we have the best instant cabin tent, and that's easily the Gazelle T4. Here are the setup timings of all the cabin tents in this video, and these timings are 1-person timings, because I set them up by myself. And the Gazelle comes in first with a setup timing of just 5 minutes. You might be thinking, hey, the Gazelle is a small tent, it's only a 4-person tent, so that's why it's set up quick. Well, that's not wrong, but look at this other 4-person cabin tent that I have. This is a non-instant cabin tent, and it took me more than double the time. As for the pack-away timings, here's another table for you. And again, the Gazelle comes in first with just a 6-minute pack-away timing, much quicker than the rest of the tents here. And of course, here's how I rated all the cabin tents in this video for their ease of use. The Gazelle doesn't just dominate in terms of setup and pack-away, it also has completely vertical sidewalls. Notice that there's no slope of the walls at all. It also has 2 doors, huge pockets all around the entire tent, and the materials of this tent are superb. Surprisingly, it has a super thick 300D polyester flooring, double the thickness of the 150D polyester in the REI and Columbia tents. And the tent body is 210D polyester, more than double the thickness of all the other cabin tents again. I've arranged the materials from the best quality to the most budget quality. These Core tents at the bottom have the most budget quality, which is polyethylene and 68D polyester. As for the most feature-rich tent, that's the Columbia Mammoth Creek. My favorite feature has got to be these two pull-out windows, which I could leave open even in the heavy rain and no water got into my tent through these windows. On the other hand, for all the other cabin tents in this video, none of them have windows that I could leave completely open in the rain. And that's because the rain flies of cabin tents tend to be quite small, so a lot of rain just drips off the rain fly and onto the mesh of the windows, usually soaking them completely. I could crack my Wonderland windows slightly open in the rain because of the above window awnings, but definitely not fully open like the Columbia. Another feature that I really liked in the Columbia is the room divider. It has easily the best room divider of all the cabin tents in this video. Usually only the bigger tents tend to have dividers, smaller tents usually don't. What I really liked about the Columbia divider is that it's completely full length, there are no gaps at all throughout the entire divider, and it's not see-through at all, so it provides a lot of privacy. The Wonderland's divider isn't too see-through as well, but there are small gaps around the divider, and I would have preferred that the divider extend all the way down to the ground like the Columbia. And the core dividers are pretty much kinda useless, because you can see the entire room through the divider, so what's the point in having it, eh? Another feature I really liked about the Columbia are the doors. It doesn't have the best doors of all these cabin tents, but it's pretty close in second place. In first place, we have the Wonderland. There are two doors, both these doors are huge, and each door takes up almost the entire wall of the tent. Also, the doors are super tall, so I didn't even have to duck when getting in and out of the tent. Both doors are completely snag-free. I could unzip and zip each door completely one-handed with no fumbling at all, and I also really loved these door pockets, which are usually much more user-friendly than door toggles. In second place, that's where we have the Columbia. Unlike the Wonderland, I did have to duck a little when getting through the doors because they're not quite as tall, and instead of door pockets, we have slightly less user-friendly door toggles. But overall, still not too bad. One thing that the Columbia beats the Wonderland in is in door size, and this T-door of the Columbia is the biggest of all the cabin tents in this video. The rest of the tents have doors that aren't as good. The core have two doors each, but these are slightly snaggy. The Gazelle has also two doors, but these are pretty small, also with the least user-friendly tie-downs, and these two other tents have only one door each. Still on features, the Columbia has one power port with a Velcro closure, and surprisingly, not all the cabin tents in this video have power ports if that's something you need in your tent. There's one feature that the Columbia was lacking though, and that's in storage. Here's another table summarizing the different types of storage options in each tent, and also how many of each the different cabin tents have. Only the first two tents had more than enough storage, the next two had an average amount of storage, and the last three big family cabin tents have so few storage options. Very weird. And with that, here's how I rated each cabin tent for features. Now, if you want the tallest possible cabin tent ever, here's the second secret pro tip I've never heard anyone else talk about. Check out this table of two different tests that I did just for you. This is a non-instant tent, and these other three are instant tents. What do you notice? The non-instant tent has a much higher peak height than the other three instant tents, even though all these tents are around the same capacity. And also, the non-instant tent has much more vertical walls than the other three instant tents too. How I got these angles and what they mean is something I explained to you during the first segment of this video, so I hope you didn't skip past that. I think the instant setup mechanism makes instant tents have significantly shorter peak heights and also more slope in their walls. So if you want a cabin tent that's as tall and as spacious as possible, go for regular setup tents and not instant setup tents. Anyway, the tallest tent that I have is the core 10-person straight wall cabin tent, and here's a table showing you the peak heights of all the cabin tents in this video. I bought and tested more than 30 different tents for this channel, and I've never come across any other tent that has a peak height higher than the core. To be honest with you though, I'm not very tall. I'm only 5'3", so this peak height was a little too tall for me. I couldn't reach the top of the tent, so every time I wanted to hang a lantern or get something in the gear loft, I had to stand up on a chair to reach it. It got a little annoying after a while. So if you're not very tall like me, you don't really need to get the tallest cabin tent out there. My bro could reach it perfectly fine though, and he's about 5'6", 5'7", just in case you need that reference. If you don't need such a high peak height in a tent, I'd recommend the Eureka Copper Canyon instead. It has a slightly lower peak height, about 6 inches lower than the core, coming in at about 84 inches, but this should be perfectly fine for most of you guys. Why I recommend the Eureka as the most spacious cabin tent is because it comes in a 12-person capacity, which is bigger than most cabin tents on the market. Notice how only the core tents come close to the max capacity of the Eureka, but remember, instant tents tend not to be as spacious, so we're going to rule out this 12-person instant core, so the Eureka is the clear winner. Another thing I looked at is the lowest height in the tent at the 4 corners. The Eureka is one of the tents that I could stand up even at the lowest height in the tent, and look, it's a little better than both my core tents. Anyway, based on the peak height, lowest height, and max capacity of each cabin tent, here's how I rated all of them for spaciousness. The most versatile cabin tent I have is the REI Skyward because it's the only cabin tent in this video that comes with a vestibule. It's not the biggest vestibule I've ever seen. It doesn't fit anything bigger than a couple of Halinox chairs, but it still gave me an extra 23.5 square feet of space, not to be specific or anything. And most importantly, I could turn the vestibule into an extended awning on hot days, which provided a ton of shade over the tent. So awning on hot days, vestibule on rainy days, I absolutely love this kind of versatility in a tent. On top of that, because this is a higher end tent from REI, I also got above average quality flooring and tent body, as well as higher quality aluminum poles. The rest of my other cabin tents are usually made of steel, fiberglass, or both, and I don't find these to be as good. And of course, unlike budget tents like Core, which don't come with all its seams taped, every single seam in my Skyward tent was perfectly taped. For quality, here's how I rated each cabin tent from the best quality down to the most budget quality tent. If you have a bigger budget to spend on a cabin tent, then the REI Wonderland is easily the best cabin tent that I've ever used. It beats all the other tents in this video in first, ventilation. When I take the rainfly off, and I recommend doing so for sunny days, check out how much mesh there is on this tent. For all the other cabin tents in this video, only the roof has ceiling mesh, plus a few large or maybe even not so large windows. However, for the Wonderland, the mesh doesn't just cover only the roof, it extends down the sides of the tent as well, and I think easily about half the tent is covered in mesh. If you're wondering, here's how much mesh there is on each cabin tent. These are not numbers that I just plucked out of nowhere. I actually measured all the windows in all the tents. I measured the vents too, I looked at the amount of ceiling mesh, and finally I came up with these estimates of the amount of mesh to fabric ratio. And of course the Wonderland comes in first, while the Skyward comes in last, because it only has 2 small windows, and these 2 walls of the tent are just entire blocks of fabric, which really limits ventilation. Based on the amount of mesh on each tent, here's how I rated all these cabin tents for ventilation. The next test that the Wonderland did the best in is the rain and wind test. I put it through 1 hour of heavy rain, followed by a few hours of moderate rain after, so basically 1 entire night of raining, and there were only 2 drops of water in the tent from the divider loops at the bottom. And that's because these loops weren't waterproofed, so once you get that seal, there should be no leaking. As far as cabin tents go, this is a pretty good result. The Columbia and Gazelle had slightly more leaking, but still pretty minimal. The Skyward actually has no leaking at all if there's no wind, but the moment there's a little bit of wind, the rain will blow under the rainfly and get into the tent within minutes. The Eureka has slightly more leaking, and the Core tents, being budget tents, had the most leaking, but overall still pretty manageable. Take note here that cabin tents tend not to be great in rain because their rainflies are usually really short. They cover only the very top of the tent and extend down at most 5 to 10 inches. The reason the Wonderland does the best is because it has a much longer rainfly than all the other cabin tents in this video. Notice how the rainfly extends all the way down to the ground for the most part. That's way longer than all the other cabin tents for sure. The divider loop is somewhere here around the non-covered part of the tent, so that's why it leaked a little bit. As for wind protection, again, cabin tents tend not to be great. Their massive sidewalls usually catch a lot of wind, and if your tent isn't staked down or guyed out, it'll blow over and barely any wind at all. I wouldn't recommend any cabin tents if you're expecting super strong wind, but if you're only dealing with light to moderate winds, then these cabin tents can do okay as long as they're guyed out and staked down. And the Wonderland has the most guy lines coming in at a whopping 14. It's not even the biggest tent here, but it has so many more guy lines than even the 10-person tents. Here's how I rated each of these cabin tents for rain and wind protection. Notice I couldn't rate any of them all that well because ultimately these are all cabin tents that aren't the best in rain and wind. Another thing that makes the Wonderland the best cabin tent is its super impressive lowest height. The peak height is 81 inches in the middle, and the extreme left and right of the tent have lowest heights coming in at 77 and 76 inches. So basically, you get the peak height, give or take a few inches, across the entire length of this Wonderland tent, which is way cool. And finally, before I tell you my best overall cabin tent pick, here are the results from all the different tests that I showed you in this video. Based on all these scores in each test and the weightage at the top here, I came up with this overall score right here in this last column. And then I plugged these overall scores into this rating to pricing graph. The vertical axis is basically just the overall score. The horizontal axis is the suggested retail price of each of these cabin tents. And here's where each tent sits on this graph. What this graph shows you is that the more you pay, the better the quality of the tent. But some of these tents can be a little bit pricey, especially the Wonderland here. And this may not work for most of you guys' budget. For me as well, because I actually paid for all these tents out of pocket, buying the Wonderland was a little bit painful for me, budget-wise. So what's the best overall pick? Which one gives you the best bang for your buck? Well, let's take out all the tents that cost more than $400, because that's usually a bit pricey for most of us. Now let's take out all the tents that scored lower than a 7, so we keep only the best performing tents. And there you have it. Pro tip number 3, for the best bang for your buck, go for the Eureka if you want a super spacious, non-instant cabin tent, and go for the Gazelle if you want an instant cabin tent. I actually tested the Gazelle along with 6 other cabin tents in this video on the screen here, just in case you're wondering why the Gazelle is the best instant tent that I recommend. Do check that out if that's more your speed. You're awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.